Hi, everyone, and welcome to Open to Debate. I'm Nayeema Raza, and today I'll be in conversation with best-selling author Malcolm Gladwell about his latest book, Revenge of the Tipping Point. It's something between a sequel and a revisitation of Gladwell's first book, written 25 years ago, called The Tipping Point. The original was about how little things make a big difference, how they gain critical mass and tip over to spread like wildfire across a culture. That was written at a time of great optimism. A lot has changed since then, and in Revenge, Malcolm looks back, considering more negative wildfires, from the opioid epidemic to a teen mental health crisis, and of course, COVID-19. He examines what has changed, and he touches on what he may have missed or gotten wrong in his earlier work. This idea of publicly reassessing one's own ideas is something that we value at Open to Debate. So I'm excited to speak to Malcolm about what it feels like to argue with himself. Now let's get into the conversation with Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm, thanks so much for joining me.
Delighted to be here.
How are you doing today?
I'm well.
Wow. So I love this title, Revenge, because it reminds me of kind of Star Wars, Revenge of the Sith. Or I want to know if you successfully exacted it from yourself. But before we get there, I'd love to start with the central question that drove you to write the original Tipping Point.
I was living in New York City in the early 1990s, and I witnessed firsthand this extraordinary transformation in the city from being one of the most dangerous big American cities to being one of the safest. That seemed to happen overnight. And I, like many other people living in New York at the time, was completely baffled by how on earth this happened. Like, we had this expectation when we got to New York that we were taking our lives in our hands. And then we woke up one day and nobody was worried about crime anymore. And I just found that absolutely fascinating.
And I want to get to that because this idea, your explanation for how crime was resolved in New York City actually has evolved in this time. And so we'll get to the broken windows theory in a moment. But first, what motivated you more recently to update it beyond, maybe a book deal?
Well, it was the 25th anniversary of the original Tipping Point, and originally I thought I would just kind of update it. But then I got really interested in this idea that, when people write sequels, they tend to write them right after you do version one, then you do version two. Rarely have I seen a sequel that was written a quarter century after part one, and I thought that was kind of fun, and interesting to look back on something over the passage of time. And I also realized that many of the ideas that I had played with in the original Tipping Point were themes I had returned to again and again and again over the course of my writing. And so this was a good opportunity to kind of sum up a lot of that rethinking. For example, every one of my books has had a section where I deal with the idea that we are influenced heavily by our environments in ways that we don't realize. I've never been very interested in looking at human beings from the inside out. I've always been interested in looking at us from the outside in. And I started that kind of outside in perspective with the Tipping Point. And I feel like I've kind of been arguing with myself about what does it mean to be influenced by your environment ever since. And so this was a good time to kind of take stock of that idea.
And I love that word you use as well, play. You use that word a lot in your writing. It's this idea of not holding anything too dear, I think. This idea of being able to, like clay, reshape ideas and reformulate concepts over time. What do you think changed more in the last 25 years, the world or yourself? Or which level of change surprised you most and mattered most for reconsidering the book?
Well, God, it's hard to choose between me and the world. The world's changed a bit. I mean, I have the best perspective on the changes that have happened in myself, of course, as all of us do. So maybe it's more striking to me, the ways in which my thinking has evolved. I I'm a lot less. I feel like 25 years ago, I was someone who was easily captured by an interesting idea. Um, and now I'm a little more wary of those ideas. I feel like 25 years ago, I was someone who was less interested in story and character. And now I tend to approach a lot more. I approach issues much more from the perspective of the people involved with the stories. I'm much more interested in narrative as a way of understanding things and as a way of reaching people with ideas. That's much more central in my work than it was 25 years ago. Um, and I'm also probably, I think I was a lot more optimistic as someone in my 30s than I am now. I'm a little more chastened by the world, as what you would expect someone in their 60s to be.
One of those things that I'm sorry to hear that, by the way, but that makes sense
You'll
because
get
you
you'll get
really
there. You'll get there. It's a
hopefully
long
not
way
too
off for
soon.
you, but yeah, trust me.
But I do, because this book really does look back. I mean, at some less hopeful epidemics, some less hopeful wildfires that have spread in our more recent times, versus the original book, which looked at really some optimistic notes, including, as you mentioned, crime and how that had changed in New York City. Now, one of the things you revisit, not in the pages of this book, but in a recent podcast episode, is how wrong you were in your original work about the broken windows theory of crime. Um, I'd love you to break that down with us, starting maybe with what was the broken windows theory, what was the theory of crime that prevails in the tipping point, and then we'll get to what's changed since then and what you've
Yeah.
learned since then.
So broken windows was an idea that was a really big deal in the 80s and 90s. And it was an epidemic theory of crime. That's why I was attracted to it, because I was very interested in the tipping point in applying the epidemic model to human behavior. And the broken windows theory said that small changes, small indices of disorder have major long-term consequences, that serious crimes arise out of minor crimes, that if you create an environment where you tolerate a broken window, somebody peeing on the street, someone jumping a subway turnstile, someone smoking weed in public, what you are doing is you are essentially telling people who are interested in more serious crimes that all bets are off. Go right ahead. No one's in charge, right?
Right.
And so it was a kind of, the way that the New York City Police Department interpreted that was that if we want to stop serious crimes like murder, rape, you name them, we've got to start by cracking down on small crimes. And that led to this policy of stop and frisk, which was the signature policy of the New York City Police Department through 2013. From the 90s for the next 20 years, they inaugurated this policy of saying the police cannot be indifferent to things that are happening on the street. They have to be proactive. And if they see some young kid walking down the street and they think that kid's got a gun on him, or that they think that kid has drugs, they should stop that kid, frisk that kid, and send a clear message to every other young kid out there that New York City's not going to stand quietly by while guns and drugs are being carried through the streets. That by 2011 or 2013, the New York City Police Department is stopping 700,000 young people a year on the streets of New York. And it was the consensus position of an extraordinary number of people in New York, myself included, that that's why crime went down so dramatically in the city. And that's what I wrote about in The Tipping Point.
Right.
I said, look, it may sound draconian and it may sound like, there may be some side effects here, but if you want to crack down on big crimes, you got to crack down on little crimes, right?
Right.
And then, wait, go ahead.
And I was going to ask you, so what makes you update it? What makes you update that thinking?
In 2012, there was a lawsuit filed against the city of New York that argued that stop and frisk was unconstitutional. A federal judge ruled in favor of that suit, And stop and frisk went from 700,000 stops a year to a negligible amount, less than 50,000. Everyone, myself included, said, oh my God, crime's going to go back up, right? And it didn't. Crime then fell even further. In fact, New York went through a second, even more extraordinary crime drop between 2013 and the beginning of the pandemic. And that second drop caused me to say, wait a second, it couldn't have been stop and frisk, because we took away stop and frisk and crime fell again, right? It had to have been something else. That was the moment where I had to revisit my previous position.
And I think there's something really powerful in that, because as you talk about it, I think you also bring up that maybe we were looking at the wrong things. The scale of stop and frisk, the 700,000 stops, which seemed to have this potent deterrent effect. But actually, there was another piece of data, which was how many people actually, being stopped and frisked had anything on their bodies that would be concerning. And that percentage was extremely low, right?
Yeah. So what arose out of that kind of lawsuit and that kind of learning opportunity, the lawsuit was called Floyd versus New York City. What arose out of the Floyd case was the realization that a much better strategy for stopping crime in big cities is the use of precision policing. And that's what we've seen in the last 10 years in New York City in particular, but other cities as well around the world, is the rise of this idea that, no, the most effective way to use police authority is incredibly selectively. And why does that work? Because criminality is not something that is spread randomly throughout the entire population. It is rather a phenomenon found in incredibly specific and knowable parts of the community. And that what you should do is focus on those very, very, very specific, discrete criminal elements.
So you've said that you think everyone should be required to re-examine what they did 25 years ago. I've heard this from you. I love this idea, although, I won't be revisiting my elementary or middle school years. But in practice, what was the experience like for you? Could you be your own editor? Or did you find yourself sometimes making excuses for your past self?
Well, it takes a while. So, a good question to ask me would be, if we learned in 2013 that the theory of if we learned in that period, 2013 to 2019, that the theory of broken windows was wrong, the stop and frisk was a mistake, why didn't I put my hand up and say I was wrong back then? Why did 5, 6, 7 years pass before I admitted that I'd been in error? Right. And the answer is because it's hard to admit you're in error, because I wasn't thinking about correcting myself, because I wasn't making a habitual practice of going through the evidence that I had used previously. Those are all kinds of, I can give you all kinds of excuses about why I didn't do it right away, but the bottom line is it's not something we do naturally or intuitively as human beings. I think what we do is we just assume we were right and we keep on going and moving forward. I think you have to make a deliberate practice out of revisiting your positions. And I didn't get to it until 2023 or 2024, right? And that's on me, right? That is a second mistake. My first mistake was to think when I wrote The Tipping Point that I had the answer, when in fact all we had was a kind of very preliminary observation. My second mistake was taking too long to revisit my first mistake, right?
Indeed. Well, we appreciate you acknowledging those mistakes. So Malcolm, when you eventually do write this book, in the 7 years it takes to reconsider it, you don't go about it by, a proclamation, a declaration, footnoting of your original work. You instead say you started with a bit of a blank page, new questions. Why that process? And why that process?
Well, I realized, that there were, if you're interested in epidemics and in thinking about social epidemics and the epidemic model as a way of explaining human behavior, two extraordinary things happened in the interval between my first book and the sequel, Revenge of the Tipping Point. One is the opioid crisis. one of the most extraordinary and catastrophic public health events in the history of this country. I mean, to this day, I do not understand why we're not talking about the opioid crisis every day. We're at over 100,000 deaths a year from opioid overdoses in America. To put that in perspective, the Vietnam War was 60,000 American deaths over, 10 years?
Mm-hmm.
That's 6 months of the opioid crisis,
Right.
I mean, and the Vietnam War caused the country to turn upside down, governments to fall. Like, it reshaped our American society. Opioid crisis is like infinitely more catastrophic source of
Right.
kind of deaths, particularly among young people. And then the other thing, of course, was COVID. We had this pandemic that caused the entire world to stop functioning for a while. So I thought, two incredible kind of case studies in epidemics have happened in the intervening 25 years. What an opportunity to kind of start over and kind of rethink the way these epidemics work.
Right. But when you go, I think about it as kind of a tree falls in the forest. I'm wondering about this idea of if reexamination makes a difference, a dent outside of yourself and people who happen to pick up both versions of the book. Once an idea like broken windows tips and spreads, can it be actually put back in a
I
bottle
think
or cleansed from a culture?
I think it does. Sort of one of the most interesting to me chapters in Revenge, the Tipping Point, is the chapter on gay marriage. And what's interesting about the marriage equality fight is that no one who was involved in that, none of the activists involved in that battle thought that it would happen as quickly as it did. They were all, they endured years and years and years of defeat after defeat after defeat. It seemed like the country, instead of warming to their cause, was turning their back on their cause. In 2004, 2005, if you asked somebody in that movement how long it would take to win public acceptance for gay marriage, they were thinking 30, 40 years. And it didn't happen that way. It happened really dramatically and suddenly. By, I don't know, 2015, the fight was over. I mean,
Right.
public just... So I was trying to figure out, that's really kind of astonishing that a change about something as fundamental as whether straight people want to share their most cherished social institution with gay people happened in almost like in a blink of an eye, right?
Right.
What that suggests is that the stories we tell each other about who we are and what we believe in and what we're willing to accept are far more volatile than we realize. That we really can change our minds about things, and we will do it relatively quickly, so long as the right conditions are in place. So I'm not someone who thinks that a noxious idea or a wrong idea can persist indefinitely. To the contrary, history tells us, no, these things come and go. They just need the right kind of circumstances.
And I want to get to what those circumstances are. And in the case of gay marriage, you take a look at common culture, the TV show Will and Grace being a critical moment for the examination of gay marriage and really the role of storytelling. You compare in your book you don't lament it, though I kind of lament it, even though I wasn't around for the earlier part, this decline of common culture. You talk about a show like MASH, which almost 50% of the American viewing audience watched the finale of, exceeding, say, the Super Bowls of the time, versus Big Bang Theory, which was the 2010s great hit, and had fewer than 5% of Americans watching that. What does this decline of common culture mean for the reconsideration of ideas and for the ability even to debate ideas amongst ourselves and with each other?
Well, yes, there has been this kind of marked decline in common experiences. So if you think about across the board, you think about it, 50 years ago in America, if you were in church on a Sunday morning, you could be reasonably sure that an overwhelming percentage of Americans were also in church at exactly that same time on Sunday morning, right? When you went home and you watched the news, you could be reasonably sure that an overwhelming majority of American households were watching the, you know, news at exactly the same time, maybe even exactly the same program. I mean, or one of three major networks, right? And when you watched a television show like MASH or the Mary Tyler Moore Show or whatever the great shows were of that era, and you went to work the next day, you knew that you could talk about them because you could have seen that everyone was watching them as well. That's gone away. We have some things we have in common now, like politics we have in common. And maybe one really interesting theory as to why politics has become such an extraordinarily divisive and present phenomenon. I mean, we seem to care more about it and debate more about it than we did 50 years ago, is that it's one of the few shared experiences we have now.
Right.
Some sporting events, some popular, like, Taylor Swift and politics
some culture.
are what we have. Some culture, not a lot.
Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, I believe. Yes.
Yes, Taylor Swift. Yes, sum it up.
But those conversations are not happening in the same spaces. I mean, one of the most interesting things about this election is just it was the zenith of kind of the fragmentation of the media environment, that people are self-selecting into their own echo chambers, into their own platforms, and social media and algorithms allow that, resistance of confrontation more perhaps now than ever. What does that mean for the kind of work you're doing in this book, this kind of work of re-examining ideas? Do you think that's a dangerous phenomenon or something hopeful?
You're absolutely right that the decline in common culture makes these kinds of, I have those 2 chapters in the book about these sudden reversals in public opinion. They are both the result of the common culture that existed through the 1990s or so in America. The fact that we had a real mass media. So that's gone away. That just means, so the job of kind of forming a new consensus around ideas, I think, is a little harder now. I don't think it's impossible. I still think we're sorting through, one thing I think about the rise of social media is it's really early in the life of these media forms. We had television, becomes this incredibly powerful social force 30 or 40 years into its life, right? It really starts to kind of assert itself in the 1970s and 80s. Well, television's invented, 40 years before that. Radio becomes a really, really powerful, transformative social force in a meaningful way when, I guess, probably during the Depression. Well, that's, well into the lifespan of that technology. So, I mean, I would say that we're still trying to kind of feel our way through the way in which we're going to be using social media. So some part of me thinks, let's wait before we make up our minds about what common culture looks like in the future. But there's no question that it has greatly complicated the task of anyone who's interested in mind changing.
Mm-hmm. It was striking to me that how little you mentioned social media in this book. I think you mentioned it once in passing as what was on the WHO's social media, or Facebook once in passing in the context of a teen mental health crisis in a town you call Poplar Grove. So why? Because you think it's too early to consider it? Because this is a very fast moving technology. I mean, it's, it's come into the hands and spread, I think, faster than television or, broadcast even. So is it possible you're missing something, Malcolm, here?
Oh, I mean, of course I'm missing something. I did not think, I was just I was being my kind of churlish self. And I just didn't think, did the world really need another book that had like 2 chapters on Twitter and Facebook and why they're the end of mankind? I sort of feel like if you want a perspective on that, there's tons of places to look. I was much, there are other things that I feel like I could contribute.
Right.
I just, I don't. Jonathan Haidt has written a brilliant book on social media and its effects. I don't think I can do better than that. So I felt I would leave that territory to people like him.
Yes. You do tackle this idea, though, of superspreaders in the book. And maybe just define quickly what a superspreader is.
So it's always been the case. So one of the kind of general principles of epidemics, social epidemics and epidemics of disease, is that it is often the case that they are asymmetrical, that the work of spreading any kind of idea or virus is done by a very, very small percentage of the population who are in some way fundamentally different from the norm. So in my first book, The Tipping Point, I talk about the law of the few, which is this idea, right? And I return to it in this book because I think that one of the ways in which the world has changed over the last 25 years is that those dynamics have become even more pronounced. So that we're now talking about the law of the very, very, very few, right? And COVID is this classic case study of this. If one of the things we began to realize very late in the pandemic was that the average person was not meaningfully spreading the virus at all. That the virus is really being spread in a very, very small number, on a very, very small number of occasions by a very, very, very small fraction of the infected population.
Right.
That, 1 in every 100 people was producing virus, that were 100 or 200, at 100 or 200 times the rate of everybody else. And it was that person who was spreading COVID. And that when we think about stopping the spread of the virus, we have to be talking about that person and not the rest of us. And that's a kind of really, really socially problematic, difficult, politically inconvenient, whatever principle to wrap your head around.
Right, because it gets away from this idea of kind of mass treatment of people. You talk about how social engineering can actually have kind of insidious effects, not just in the case of thinking about something like COVID, but also in social engineering around college campuses to try to come up with the right diverse population that's diverse enough, but not too diverse to challenge the status quo. In the case of COVID, you talk about researchers kind of looking at the viscosity of someone's saliva or their dehydration to try to understand who is a super spreader. And then you wonder, well, does it matter? Because are you not going to sit next to someone on a plane because they exhibit characteristics of, say, obesity, which are linked to that? In an age of social media, it seems that, and I am going to make you consider it, which you don't in the book, how do you think of super spreaders? In this election, for example, is Donald Trump a super spreader? Is Joe Rogan? Is Elon Musk?
Yeah.
Who is the most effective?
Well, one of the things we know from looking at online information online is that information online is massively asymmetrical in exactly the way that I've been talking about. I think 30% of content on in social media is considered toxic, and it's generated by 3% of users. 80% of fake news comes from 0.1% of social media users, right? That's the definition of a super spreader, right? A tiny, tiny fraction of the population is playing a hugely outsized role in spreading a certain kind of idea, meme, idea virus, whatever you want to use. So these dynamics absolutely are playing out online. And, there's any number of lessons, there's all kinds of good lessons from that. One is that to understand why, for example, disinformation might spread online, you need to have an incredibly focused lens, right? The majority of us are not implicated in that process. But the second and really, really hopeful lesson is that you can't look at online information and draw the conclusion that we are hopelessly divided as a nation, or we are as a nation in the thrall of disinformation and fake news. No. Most of us are fine, right? All this stuff, this toxic stuff, is being spread by a tiny fraction of people. We need to keep that in mind. It's not your neighbor across the way who is, a kind of malignant force online. No, it's one dude somewhere in a basement who's kind of having a massively magnified effect on the public discourse. So we need to keep that in mind, that what we're observing here, social media has the effect of making marginal voices seem mainstream. That is its function as presently constructed, right? You got to keep that in mind when you draw inferences from social media.
Yeah, and anonymity and scale makes that seem difficult on social media. Do you think of yourself as a super spreader? Not in the malicious way, but as a spreader
Yeah,
of these ideas. 10,000 hours, is a good example of an idea that has caught wind and reached a tipping point of its own.
yeah. I mean, it's hard to say. Do I think of am I someone who has uh, you know, a large platform,
Hmm.
larger than many other journalists? Yes. Does that make me a super spreader? I don't know. I don't think I'm, I don't, there's I don't think that in my books I am someone who is actively trying to win converts to a particular perspective. I think of myself as someone who's simply trying to start conversations. So if I am a kind of super spreader, it's with a different intention than an influencer or someone spreading fake news, right? Um, the people who were spreading disinformation about the COVID vaccine
Hmm.
were trying to affect a very particular change in behavior. I'm not going that far.
Right. I do. One of the things I find really remarkable about your work is your ability to synthesize these concepts, to distill them down to these ideas. 10,000 hours, a law of the few, now a law of the third. Do you worry that those mnemonics, those ideas, they're so sticky um, and memorable that they can kind of become cement and become hard to reconsider because of?
Mm, I don't think so. I mean, I think that there's a trade-off here, right?
Mhm.
One is that I can write about, I always think about my dad, who was a theoretical mathematician,
Mhm.
who wrote for an audience of, I mean,
Theoretical
he wrote books that,
mathematicians.
yes,
Yes,
tiny, tiny, tiny.
that large.
In order to
Yeah.
understand my father's books, you had to have an IQ north of 100 and whatever it was, 70, and a deep background in vibration theory and
Mhm.
inverse, problems, and an appetite for enormous complexity, right?
Right.
So, you know, the trade-off he made a trade-off. He narrowed his audience to a tiny um, as tiny as possible in
Mhm.
order to and on the other hand, on the other side of the equation, he was free to be as nuanced and complicated and sophisticated in his ideas as possible, right? I'm interested in the opposite trade-off, right? I'm interested in having a broad audience, but I understand that if I want to have a broad audience and reach lots of people, I can't be like my dad. I can't, right? I can't just be, you know, talking about ideas in the most sophisticated and nuanced way possible. So you have to be aware, all of us who are in the world of ideas play with that
Mhm.
trade-off. And we strike a balance somewhere between complexity and reach.
Mhm.
And I have, I have placed my
Yeah. Pick.
optimal balance somewhere on that continuum.
Mhm.
You place it somewhere different, I suspect. I don't know. Everyone does. That's
Right.
if we're in the business. So I sort of think that I would say, in answer to your question,
Mhm.
yes. That yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
somewhere on that continuum. And if other journalists may want to be somewhere else.
Mhm.
And I accept the fact that, like every other journalist does, I
Right.
accept the fact that I've got to, if I'm going to live with the upside of where I land, I've
Right.
got to also be honest about the downside.
Yeah. I love that comparison to your father, and know you talk about him also, and as a figure for helping you reconsider work, helping you kind of think back to theories, as mathematicians do consistently. Um, the last question here, you talk about this idea of overstories in the book.
Hmm.
I found it so powerful. This, this idea that overstories is something you describe. Let me read a quote from your book. An overstory is the upper layer of foliage in a forest, and the size and density and height of the overstory affect the behavior and development of every species far below the forest floor. You go on to say, it's not something explicit that's drilled into every inhabitant. The overstory is made up of things way up in the air, in many cases outside of our awareness. So this idea, I found it so amazing. These stories we tell ourselves, but we forget that we tell ourselves. So they exist, to use the David Foster Wallace thing, as water, right? This is just water. And they turn out to be very powerful. I'm curious if you think the United States, this country that, has just gone through an election, in a country that we read as polarized more, as much now as at almost any point of its history, does it have an overstory? Can something of that scale have an overstory?
Oh yeah. In fact, I think of the overstory of America um, as uh, as powerful as ever. We don't, you know, I am an immigrant to this country. I suspect your family are at some
Yes,
point
I'm first.
immigrants to
I'm
this country.
firstborn. Yes.
You're firstborn, yeah. Okay, so um, I have a ton of cousins in Long Island who are immigrants to this country.
Right.
Why did we come here? Well, we came here for a reason, right? Because there was a story that was being told about America that we believed in and beckoned us, right? That it was a land of opportunity. Um, I still think that I think that's the most important and powerful story this country has. That story is intact. I don't think that any individual election can dislodge the meaning of that story or make it people from all over the world are just as likely to come to this country today as they were before the election, right? No one's like saying, I'm not coming anymore, right? No, like the story's intact. And it's a really, really powerful story. And let me tell you, there are a million countries in this world that do not have a story like that, right? You know, a big chunk of my family came from Jamaica. People don't move to Jamaica thinking that it's a place where that rewards the best and the brightest and where there is infinite opportunity. That's not the story of Jamaica. It has a story, but that's not it, right? They wish they had that story, as do countless other countries. So I think, we sometimes I think we get so caught up in the day-to-day quotidian disagreements that make up contemporary politics that we lose sight of the fact that there's still something powerful and wonderful about the United States. And that story has been in place for 250 years,
Right.
more than that, 300 years.
Yeah. In some ways, it feels like the election was a debate over that story and how to reclaim that overstory again.
It's been, I mean, if you think about it, you said we're as divided today as we ever were. That's where I would part ways with you. I mean,
That's what the
look, we
data
had
tells us, as
well, but
as
I
if not
mean,
more polarized. Yeah.
Civil War,
Right.
I would say, was a
Yeah.
moment of pretty extraordinary division. And by the way, Civil War was a fight over that overstory, right? Does this notion of the land of opportunity, does it apply to Black people?
Right.
Right?
How
We went
how
to
far
war
does it
over that.
reach? Yes.
Yeah. And then in, 60 years after the Civil War, we had a huge debate about, does this apply to women? Should women be able to vote, right? And we redefined that story once again. So we do, in the 60s, we went back and we redefined. So it's in a constant state of kind of refinement. And almost all of those refinements have been for the best, right? I feel like every one of those things has made us better off than we were before.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Malcolm. We're going to get to some additional question askers. The first is going to be coming from Philadelphia. Julia M. Klein is a Philadelphia-based cultural reporter and critic and a contributing book critic at The Forward. She also reviewed your latest book, Malcolm. So Julia, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Hello. Hi, everybody.
Hi. Hi. What
Hi,
is your
Julia.
question for Malcolm?
Well, I was interested in following up on the political question that you were just discussing. I wonder if what ideas in the book might help us understand the results of the recent election. In other words, can you define or pinpoint the tipping point that might have inspired the shift towards the Republicans and Donald Trump?
I mean, I don't know. Uh, I'm reluctant. I'm always reluctant to kind of weigh in on American politics, and particularly reluctant to do so on November 13th, when I feel like I would much rather be asked that question 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, when we have some perspective. So I don't know. I will only say this to the point that that I was making in my conversation with Nayeema, that we are in this particular moment in our culture where the voices of a very small number are magnified, and that the the popular culture has moved from these kinds of large consensus based institutions to these fragmented voices. So working through the logic of that strikes me as being a kind of fruitful way of understanding what happened. But beyond that, I don't. I'm going to duck that question. Is that okay? I'm Canadian. I don't. Why do I have to answer questions about American politics?
An immigrant, Malcolm. You've earned the right. You've earned the right.
Well, I'm green card, not a citizen.
Oh,
Still,
okay.
yeah, I'm green card only.
Do you have another question, though? I would love to ask Julia if there's something else that you had in mind for Malcolm.
Sure. What have you learned from your critics who have seem to have multiplied over the years?
Yeah. Have my critics multiplied? I feel like they've always been there. I feel it's just as many. You said no book of mine has ever been well reviewed, so I sort of feel like I think it was the same. What have I learned from them? Well, sometimes you read. There are many different kinds of critics. There are those who I feel like are not in good faith, and those who are in good faith. And one of the things that I heard at the beginning of my career that I tried to respond to is I feel like at the beginning of my career, I heard a lot of criticism about the way I used evidence, that I was being overly selective in my use of social science evidence and over-reliant on certain perspectives. And so what I've done, if you look at the course of my writing over the years, I have responded to that. My books are far more... I'm far more careful, I think, in the way I use social science now. The ideas, the arguments I'm making are far less reliant on social science sources, and I feel I'm a little more careful in which ones I choose to highlight. Whether I've been successful, that is for others to say, but I have absolutely learned. I think in the beginning of my career, I was like I was a little bit of a social science fanboy, and I was a little too uncritical in the way that I embraced some of those ideas. And I feel like I'm a little bit more savvy now as a result of listening to criticism.
Thank you so much, Julia, for that question. Our next question comes from someone else who's reviewed your book, and I find it hard to believe your book of yours has never been reviewed well, Malcolm. Is that really true?
If you could find a positive review of any one of my books in any major publication, I will give you $10.
The fact I read in The Economist you'd sold 23 million copies of your books in the United States alone. So I hope that helps offset some of the reviews you're getting. Our next question comes from Andrew DeMillo of the Associated Press. Andrew is the Capital correspondent for the AP's Little Rock Bureau. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you.
What is your question?
Yeah, my question was this: your book, you did something that politicians don't do often, which is admit mistakes or admit things that you want to revisit. What would you recommend to politicians and public policy officials who are reluctant to do that, who are reluctant to admit mistakes or revisit decisions that may have been mistakes?
Super interesting. I've always been puzzled by this. So why is it that we judge politicians in particular so harshly when they make mistakes, right? So this is a dumb example, but I spend a lot of time listening to sports podcasts. And people who are weighing in on basketball or football, if they were a big fan of somebody coming out of college, guy gets drafted number 2, turns out to be a bust. And no one has any problem with, ESPN's major college basketball analyst saying, I thought so-and-so was going to be great, and he wasn't, right? Why did I go wrong? And then it's fine. And in the business world, CEOs stand up all the time and say, we made an error, and it's considered to be part of the learning process. There's something about politics that is allergic to that kind of honesty. And I wonder whether I'm of the opinion now that it's all in the politicians' heads, that they greatly overstate the kind of consequences of saying, I was wrong, right? They think they have to give some long, complicated sidestep. They think it's kind of, they worry about being accused of being, waffling on an issue or flip-flopping. There's all these sort of terms. But in fact, all of us change our mind about things all the time. That all of us, in fact, if you think about our closest relationships, when your spouse or partner admits they were wrong on something, how do you feel? You generally feel relieved or happy, or like you think it's about growth, right? And they do the same for you if it's a real relationship. So I think politicians need to just, get real with themselves and understand that sometimes the best answer to a question is, I was wrong. Now I know better. I'm going to try not to make the same mistake again. And then just end the question. Just like, that's it. That's all you need to say. And I think people will be happy with that.
I have actually a follow-up to that. I will push back to that, which is there's something particular about politics. I mean, CEOs often get ousted by boards when they make mistakes, especially big ones. And there's something unique about politics where there's someone who wants your job in waiting, and it's that highly competitive environment. Don't you think there's some pressure that's particular to our politics that that makes it hard to update our opinions? And
well, of course it's hard.
yeah, but it makes it different, like makes that analogy imperfect or the metaphor imperfect.
I don't know. I don't buy it. I mean, I'm open to, you're absolutely right that there is a set of social expectations that surround politicians that are slightly different than people in other positions of leadership. Yeah. However, so it's not going to be super easy ever to say I was wrong. But I'm struck by how infrequently anyone even tries that strategy, right? How do we know it won't work? No one ever tries it.
Yeah.
Right? What,
it's just lie.
I would like to see some empirical evidence of this as a losing strategy. So what we're saying is it is somehow worse for a politician to say, I learned from the evidence and my own behavior, and I now think there's a better way. That's worse than simply sticking to your guns when your policy is disastrous. Like, I don't understand why that would be the case.
And I'm making no excuses for politicians here. In fact, I do advocate for more honesty, especially in an era that rewards authenticity in social media. We have not moved toward that at all in our politics, seems. I don't know, Andrew, if you have any other questions?
Yeah, if you don't mind, one more political related question. There's been a lot of hand-wringing and kind of second guessing about polling heading into the election this year. Given the type of research you do, and not just with political polling, but generally, are problems with polling and concerns about responses, that type of thing, what kind of impact does that have on the type of research and the type of work that you do?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I in my book Blink, my second book, I talk a lot about the difficulty of figuring out what people believe, both because they don't always tell you what they believe, and secondly, they don't always know what they believe. People's stated responses are often very different from their. And I use the example in that book about an extraordinary number of incredibly successful television shows when they take the pilot and they show it to a test audience, the audience says they hate it, and the audience doesn't actually the show goes on to be this massive success. Seinfeld, for example, had terrible reviews, right? And the explanation for that is that when people say they hate something, it means one of two things: I actually hate it, or it's so new and different, I don't know what I think about it, right? And that they both those diametrically different emotional responses come out the same way. I hate it, right? That just means that when people report on their beliefs, social science has told us for years, we need to be careful. And I think pollsters have gotten into this weird position where they just think that their profession is immune from one of the fundamental rules of human behavior, right? They think you can actually ask somebody how they're going to vote in a highly contested election, and they'll tell you exactly, they'll give a precise and meaningful prediction. Well, who said that was, whoever said that was possible, right? I mean, why are we surprised when it turns out it doesn't work? I'm much more stunned when the polls are right than when the polls are wrong, right? I never thought this was a project that was ever going to work out well, particularly when, and we have these indices. There's something called the Bradley effect. When Tom Bradley, who was a African American, who was the first black mayor of Los Angeles, first time he ran, he was way ahead in the polls, lost dramatically. Then he was way ahead of the polls to be governor of California, lost dramatically. And there was something called the Bradley effect, which is that when it comes to a black candidate, voters lie. They say they like the candidate and they actually don't. Hello, why is this hard, right? So anyway, I think this is a useful reminder that human beings are very complex. And a lot of pollsters should go back to school and take psychology classes.
Thank you very much, Malcolm, for that animated answer. And thank you, Andrew, for your questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew.
Our last questioner is Emily Stewart, a senior correspondent at Business Insider. Emily, welcome.
Hi, thank you. So a lot of this has been kind of talking about things that it took you 25 years to revisit. Is there something that you are thinking about now, something in this book that you think, maybe I should be revisiting that already, and maybe I didn't get that quite right? Or is there something that you are really sure that you are right about right now?
Well, there's nothing I'm sure I'm right about right now. One thing I've learned in my many years is that you should never, ever, ever, ever think that you have that degree of certainty. So I guess you're asking, of all the things that I believe at the moment, which do I think are the most speculative?
Yeah.
And like, what do I like it to be? Well, one of the things that's happened to me in the last 25 years is I've become a parent. And I have, in the course of becoming a parent, revisited just about every belief I once had about what it means to be an effective parent. So that's sort of, actually, I'm joking, but I'm actually sort of deadly serious about this. I think the mistake I made was to think of the influence of a parent on a child as being far more considerable and predictable than it actually is. I actually think, now that I am a parent, that aside from being kind and feeding them and keeping them away from scary things, it's just not a lot of, you don't have a lot of influence. They're their own creatures. And it's made me think that a lot of the kind of parental advice business is just kind of hokum. It's we're just pretending. Parents spend enormous amounts of time pretending that their influence is much more important than it actually is, just to make themselves feel better about the job of parenting. But in fact, I think we're lying to ourselves. That kids are their own little autonomous units. So that's one thing that I've had reason to. I think at various points in my life, have made the mistake of handing out advice to parents, and I would take it all back. What's another thing that I'm likely to be wrong about? There's so many. In my podcast, I've taken so many outlandish positions over the years that it's probably a long list. I was thinking about one this morning, which was I did a whole bunch of things about how I thought that lotteries were a better way of picking leaders than elections. And if somebody were to do, what we don't have in that is a large scale study of whether that's actually true. I would love, part of me thinks might be true, but I would love for us to have a couple of major election cycles to be replaced by lotteries, just to figure out whether we would get a better leader out of that. I'd like a bunch of really selective schools for 5 years to switch to a lottery system and see whether they get a better group of students. And if I'm wrong, I could be wrong. Maybe it actually is better to have an election or to have an admission system, and that I should retire my infatuation with lotteries. But I'd love to find that one out. That seems like a good one to investigate.
All right, Harvard, if you're listening.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for your question, Emily. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. So just as we wrap up, I'm curious, Malcolm, you've talked a lot about how you've reassessed your own ideas, and you've talked about two things that I love. Like one is the impact of time and change and the need for that. Not, there's a thirst to examine this election result, and you're saying, hold on a minute. The other is the way in which we tell ourselves stories, or we can very quickly, glibly, I don't know if that's the right word, but flipply change our minds on important topics. Are there things that make that more possible? Love, you gave the example of relationships. I mean, love makes that possible, it seems. Personal change. But what do you think is a way that for people listening, they could test their own certainty about ideas, or encourage themselves to be more conscious of the way in which they're changing their minds or making up their minds?
Well, I think we need to be clear about that there is a distinction between values and ideas. And I think it's really easy to confuse the two. That I am not, as a human being, the sum total of my ideas. I am the sum total of my values, right? And I can change every one of my ideas tomorrow, and that does not fundamentally change who I am, as long as I keep my values intact. And this was the lesson that my dad, I think, taught me, because he was someone who was absolutely sure about his values. He was someone who he believed in fairness. He believed in God. He believed that every person need to be, regardless of who they were, should be treated with respect. I could go on. He had really, really rock solid values, but his ideas were like, you could convince him of anything. He just did not think of, and I think that's when I talk about why is it hard for politicians to admit that they were wrong about something, because they're not admitting they were wrong about their values. They should articulate their values clearly and say, I am never going to back down on this. But they should say, my ideas are separate. And when evidence changes, I promise you I will change my mind about those kinds of things. And if you can keep that distinction alive, I think it does become a lot easier to change your mind.
Yeah, not just alive, but make it more attractive, more compelling, in fact, to do that, see that as a value to imbue. That's lovely to hear about your father. Do you think we'll be back here in 2049 with a new one, like a tipping point with a vengeance? Is that the plan?
I'm still around.
I hope you will be.
I'm an old man. I don't know. You want me on the show when I'm in a wheelchair and like dribbling into a cup.
We will. Thank you so much, Malcolm, for the time. I want to say thank you also to the journalists who joined me in asking questions to you. And thanks to you, the audience, for tuning in to this episode of Open to Debate.